Hi everyone, it's me Terry from the Yarnjoy podcast, and I wanted to come on and make another video giving some more of the great tips that were given to me as a response to a 1,000 subscriber giveaway that I had, where the entry to enter the giveaway was to leave comments in that video of giving me a yarn related, crochet, crafting related tip. And they were such good tips that I wanted to share it with everybody. So let's pop over to my list here, or I'm going to, and here my laptop, and give you some more of them. So let's see what we can learn today. Okay, so this tip comes from Sonia Jones of Sonia Jones Crafty Life. Hi, Sonia. And she said, it says, okay, so when you're decreasing, she says to decrease going through the front loop only of the stitch, because normally when you decrease, you're doing like you're turning 2 stitches into 1. And so you put your hook into the first stitch, and ordinarily, unless they say front loop only or back loop only, usually you go under 2 strands of yarn in that stitch. Well, if you're decreasing, that means you're going to you put the hook into the first stitch, and then you kind of wrap around and put your hook into the next stitch, and then you pull your yarn through both of them together. And so so the top of that stitch, you finish your stitch like regular, the top of that stitch will end up being 1 stitch. So it's like 2 were pulled together as 1. Anyway, so when you're decreasing, especially when you're doing amigurumi and something that you're going to stuff, if you decrease using just the front loops of those 2 stitches only when you put them together, then you'll have that other loop, the back loop, it'll be still there behind it, and it kind of fills in any holes or gaps or anything that may show stuffing through when you stuff that object. So I do that. I think that is called invisible join, and there are several. Not invisible join, I'm sorry, invisible decrease, I think. I'll try to find a couple of tutorials that show how to do that stitch, and I will link it in the description box below. But that is a great tip, Sonia. I do that when I do my decreases, and I have found that's very helpful, and the result looks really great, so that's a good tip. Okay, the next one is from S. Kazmiski, and forgive me if I pronounce everyone's names wrong. I'm just assuming that's how you pronounce it. So let's see. Her tip says, or her or him, sorry, I don't know, because it just has the first initial is S, so I just want to say that. So anyway, it says, my tip is to remember to count your stitches. I still mess up and have to frog, but if you keep a correct count of your stitches, your item will look the way it's supposed to look. And that's very true, especially when you're doing a large project. For example, the stitch sampler blanket that I'm working on, it's a very good pattern, because at the end of each row it has how many stitches you should be ending up with on each side. And I don't, if it's a pretty simple stitch for that previous row, I don't always count my stitches every row, but I do try at least every 2 or 3 rows to count my stitches and to make sure that I'm ending up the same number of stitches, because is what the row says. Because especially if you're doing a sample where you're changing, like a sampler type project, and you're changing the types of stitches, it's very important to make sure you have the right stitch count. The Around the Bases blanket is another one that is that way, and Franco Randall's patterns, he also gives a stitch count at the end of each row of what you're supposed to end up with. So it really saves you from having to rip out like several rows of work because you messed up somewhere, like you might have skipped a stitch or added too many stitches or something, right? Like 2 or 3 rows down, and then you have to go back and fix it. So either that or fudge it somehow to get your counts up right. So, but that's a very good tip. Okay, the next tip is from Sandra Tester, and this one says to make sure you purchase enough of your die lot to complete projects, and that's very true. It's very good to make sure if you have a particular project in mind, you know exactly how much yarn you're going to need. It is a good idea to go ahead and buy the amount that you need all at once, so then that way the shades won't be off in your color, especially if it's like a solid color. It can happen. I know I've had one project that I had the yarn, but for my that's if you know the project that you're going to use that yarn for, of course, because I had a yarn that I was using, and I'd had it a long time. I ran out of it, so I had to go back, and luckily they still made that yarn because it was several years old, and they still made that yarn, or the name was the same, but if you pull them up together they are slightly off in color. So it's always a good idea to get all the yarn that you need at once when you're starting a project. So, great tip. Okay, the next tip is from Kathy, and now this, I don't know if it's Gist or Gist, spelled G-I-S-T, so forgive me, Kathy, if I pronounce it wrong. But her tip is, she says that she likes to crochet bags, which I do too. She says that she cuts plastic canvas to fit the bottom, and then cover the plastic canvas with sticky backed felt. Now I have used I have one tote bag that I needed to reinforce, and because it was just real floppy, and so I did use plastic canvas. So plastic canvas is a very good material to use as far as helping your bags to stand up. And I have never heard of sticky backed felt. I guess it comes that way, but that's a very good idea to have, because that way you can cover it, and then if you don't line the bag immediately after you make it, well, at least that plastic canvas, those sections are covered, and so that way you don't necessarily have to line it right away, or not even line it if you get those pieces are covered really well. So that's a neat idea. I'll have to remember that. Okay, the next tip is from Jody, and this is another one. I'm not sure if it's solemn or solemn. Sorry, Jody. But her tip says, let's see, my tip would be, if you buy the yarn for a specific project, and if you're not going to start the project right away, put it in some sort of bag or container with a pattern, and then that way you won't forget why you bought the yarn for. And that's exactly true. I try to do that. I know I have a basket that I have reserved from some yarn that I want to do. Well, it was a few episodes back. I did it's one of the 365 days of Granny Squares project squares that I made. This one turned out very large. Has a star right in the middle, and I made it red, white, and blue, if you remember. But anyway, I decided to use that since it turned out so much larger than my other squares that I've been using for blankets. So I'm going to use that square as around the bases pattern. And so I went ahead and gathered all the yarn that I had of that particular color to reserve it, to use it for that particular project. So that way I don't get into it and start using it for something else. So, but yes, that's definitely a good idea to put it all together, even with the pattern, and if you have the pattern printed out, even maybe with the hook and everything, and you have it all packaged together, not packaged, but you know, all together, and that way you'll remember that's why you bought the yarn for. So that's a very good tip. Yes, thank you, Jody. Okay, and let's see, the next one is from Jammin' with Yarn, and this viewer says, let's see, she says she's a new crocheter, and she said her tip is don't rush to purchase all the fancy fine yarn until you build your skill level up. Now, I think I know what she's talking about here is the fact that when you're learning, okay, you may end up doing a lot of ripping out and redoing because you're a beginner and you're learning, which is that's how you learn. But yes, the acrylic yarn, using acrylic yarn is the well, I wouldn't say cheaper, but you know, the more cost-effective, I guess, yarn. That way it'll hold up for to the ripping out and all that, because if you some of the real fancy yarn that's really super soft and more expensive and whatnot, well, if you use it, a lot of times it's very difficult to pull out, especially if it likes to grab onto each other, the stitches. I know there's some yarns that do that. And so if you're not exactly sure that you're doing the stitches right, or you feel like, you know, you're more of a beginner, and your skill level maybe is not as high as some others that have been crocheting for 50 years or more, or 30 years, whatever, to start out using I would say start out using the acrylic yarns, because they're more forgiving as far as ripping out and using it again and fixing and stuff like that, you know, and of course very easy care also afterwards. So yes, that's a very good point. Okay, and the next tip is from Denise Woodside. And she says, let's see. She says that her tip she's sharing actually is from Crystal at Bag a Day Crochet. And she says, if you struggle with straight sides and maybe miss putting stitches in your turning chain, instead of chaining 3 and turning for a double crochet, chain 1 and turn and do a double crochet back into that same stitch. Okay, yes. Now, I know some people have this trouble, especially if they're beginners, where if they're doing a flat panel, the sides, sometimes if you forget that turn, especially if you're going back and forth, okay, left, you know, back and forth. When you go to the end, you have to chain, like, okay, so if you're doing double crochets, you chain up 3 and then you turn it and you go back the other direction. But you got to remember that chain up 3 that you did when you come back towards it, turned and come back the other direction, that chain up 3 is actually your first stitch. And so, and of course the top of that chain up 3 looks different than the top of double crochets. And so sometimes, and I mean, I even do that now occasionally, where sometimes you don't, you kind of think, oh, well, is that a stitch? Am I supposed to go into that, or that's just the side of the same stitch? You know, it's kind of confusing because the tops of the top looks so much different, you know, than the other stitches. Especially if you've changed it, and if you chained and then turned, it'll even be heading the different direction than the stitch that you made, so it would definitely look different. So if you what she suggested to do is instead of chaining 3 and then turning and going back the other way for double crochets. Of course, if it's half double crochets, you would chain 2 and do the same thing, you know, but we're just using the chain 3 as an example. But the chain 3 and then go back double crochet and then chain 3 and then go back, and when you get back over there, to make sure that you get a stitch into that chain, because if you don't, then your sides will start going narrow, you know, and they won't be straight on either side. Your piece will start getting narrower because it's like you're decreasing on accident, you know. And so she suggested, instead of the chaining 3 and turning, you chain 1 and then go ahead and turn, and then do a double crochet into that chain 1 that you did, so it actually turns it into a stitch where the top of it will look like all your other stitches. And so then when you come back to it and have to stitch into that stitch, it will look like the stitch right before it, and it would be easier for you not to miss it. Now, I haven't done that But I think that is a really cool idea, and I definitely want to start putting that into practice and see if that helps me from skipping stitches or putting too many or whatever on the ends. I think that's a really great tip, and I definitely want to try it out. Thank you, Denise. Okay, and then let's see, the next one comes from Monique, and she says, if you start a blanket with a chain, crochet the chain with a hook one size bigger than the rest of the blanket. Now, I've even heard this in knitting as well, like your cast on row, that if you use a needle that is larger than what the needles say, that then when you go back and work into that chain, it's easier to get the needle into those chains because the chain's not that tight. So same thing with crochet. If you chain, well, especially if you have a tight tension anyway, so if you do that starting chain with a larger hook and then go back to the regular hook when you're going to go back across into that chain to start working your blanket or your project, if you do that, then that chain that you started, it won't be so tight, and you'll be able to get your hook into each chain to put your first stitches in all the way across much easier. So I think that, especially like I said, if you have very tight tension, that would be a really good tip to try. If you have very loose tension, then you may not need to do that. So I think it really depends on the way that you crochet. So, but I think it's a great tip, a great thing to remember and to try out if you're having trouble with that. Okay, and then the next one is from the channel name is the Sosa family, and I do know that is Petra. And Petra says, when I want to do crochet eyes or like stitch eyes on amigurumi, if you want to use thread. Now, not if you're using safety eyes, of course, but if you're stitching on the eyes. She says, and if you don't have thread to use and you want some finer stitches, or you don't have embroidery floss, which is sometimes I use that as well, she says she doesn't buy thread to do it. What she does is she just picks the yarn, the color that she wants for the eyes, and then she'll split it, because worsted weight yarn, when you split it, let me get an end here, I don't know if I'll be able to see it, but if you kind of separate it out, it's going to have 4 little strands. Now this is just worsted weight acrylic, and when I do that, you kind of tap the end of it and it kind of starts separating out, and then you can see that, if I can get it up there, see, maybe. Anyway, there ends up being 4 little strands. So I'll split it and I'll pull them apart like that and make it smaller, and then I will use that with an even smaller needle than just a yarn needle, and you can get your stitches finer. And so she suggested doing that. Instead of using thread, you can just use your yarn and split it, separate the strands as small as you want for you to use if you want really fine stitches for that. And she even suggested, also, she said that you could even split the two and use more than one color. Like if you want only 2 strands, then split this into all 4 separate, use a single strand, and then do another color and put it with that single strand to make 2 strands, and then use that, and you're even going to alter the color of the eyes even more. And I think that's would give that a really cool effect. I'd never thought about doing that, but I think that would be kind of cool. You might have, you may use a strand of blue and a strand of green, and it might really give the little animal or doll or whatever you're doing very pretty eyes. So I think that's a really neat idea. I really like that. Okay, and let's see. Now, the next one is from Jane at Scraptastic Yarns Podcast. And she says, let me read here. She says, she says, I always attach a note to the pattern I'm working on with the hook size. And then she says she marks off each row with a pencil as she's doing it. And she says if you put that pattern, if your pattern is printed, if you put it in a sheet protector, then you could use like a, well, she said a grease pencil or something that you can wipe off, and then you can use the pattern again because you didn't actually mark on the pattern. Or like a dry erase marker or something like that. I think that's a great idea. In fact, I do that. Well, sometimes I'll write with a pencil right on the pattern paper. I've been guilty of doing that. But also I might just take a scrap piece of paper and put a bunch of hash marks as I'm doing my work rounds. I've even done that way too. So, but I think that's a very good idea that Jane has given us here. So that's cool. So let's see. I'm going to do one more here, and then I have one on my phone that I want to give you because this one is from somebody had commented and gave me a tip on another video, and so I wanted to include it into this group. So one more off of this, my laptop here, and then one more off my phone, and then that'll be it because I don't want to overwhelm you with so many tips. Okay, so this one says, it was from Suzanne McElwee. I think that's right. I'm hoping I'm saying it right. And this is, let's see, my tip is I have little markers that I bought years ago at Michael's, and they have little beads. The little beads that are on them, I guess they're stitch markers. So they have little beads have letters of the alphabet on them, okay? And she says she'll use the project, whatever, I guess, in other words, I'm sorry, I'm messing this tip up. I don't mean to. My brain is going off. Okay, never mind. Okay, my tip is I have little markers that I bought years ago at Michael's. The little beads have letters of the alphabet. I have picked up projects and couldn't remember what the hook I was using, and I definitely have done that too. Okay, hook one of the markers on, and there's no question about it. The one I put on a new project this morning has a big J on it, so she knows that she's using a J hook for the project. Okay, sorry, my words are muddled. I was trying to kind of paraphrase, and it wasn't working out too good. Anyway, I know what she's saying, okay? So she said that she found at Michael's some stitch markers that had letters on them, lettered beads on them, and that she would use that, clip it to the project, and the letter would be according to what hook size she's using for that project, okay? I haven't seen ready-made stitch markers that have the letters on there. I think that's a great idea. Now, I've even seen beads, the separate little beads where you could make your own that have letters also. But if they do have markers that you can get, and I've even seen stitch markers, I think on Etsy, where people have made those as well. But I think it's a great idea. And definitely you want to mark your project with a hook, because I'm forever getting a hook from one project and thinking, oh, I'll just use it, I'll put it back. Well, if I don't get right back to that project, a lot of times I will forget what hook size I used, and then I get into trouble. So that's a great idea, Suzanne. Great idea. Okay, last one for this video is, and of course my phone went dark, so I have to wake it back up here again. Okay, this is from Sandy Chain, is the channel name. And she says that to mark her place on my paper when I'm crocheting, I use a long duckbill hair clip. So I happen to have one. I think I know what she's talking about. I think she's talking about these clips, like that, see? Okay, and which is a good idea. They're long and they're thin, almost like a pointer. And so if you're stopping on your pattern, you can do this on the edge, and you can get it pointed to whatever row. Let me get in the camera here. Whatever row that you're on, okay? And it holds pretty sturdy, so I don't think it would move around too much and you won't lose your place. So if you're down here and you're on this 4th round or something, you can just point to it like that, and that tells you what row you're on. And she said that her mother did that for years when she crocheted. So I think that's a great idea. Great tip. Thank you, Sandy, for sharing it with us. And thank you, everybody, for all the tips that I've mentioned today. Thank you so much for contributing your tips to us so then we can learn something from them. So I really appreciate everybody that entered and left comments and tips for us. Okay, so I guess that's it. This is Sunday for me. Still have my duds on from church. And so I thought I'd just pop on here right quick and do the video while I'm looking kind of snazzy. Anyway, and that's it. I will be back on Thursday with the next regular episode of the Yarnjoy podcast, and that will be episode number 60, I think. So thanks everybody for watching, and I hope everybody enjoyed the tips and can find them useful. And I will be making more of these videos because I have more tips that I can go through and share with everybody. So I guess that's it. Well, this is the end of the weekend, but have a great week upcoming, everybody, and I'll see you back here in the Yarnjoy podcast studio on Thursday. So we'll see you Thursday. Bye.